Hello everyone, welcome back. We are going to be discussing chapter 21 from the Cooper, Huron, and Heward textbook, the 3rd edition. This chapter is going to be covering imitation, modeling, and observational learning. This chapter, along with the next few chapters, the ones on shaping and chaining, all these chapters combined are going to be discussing different ways that we have within behavior analysis to acquire new behavior. Imitation, modeling, and observational learning specifically are responsible for a great deal of learning that occurs without intentional intervention from others. So we're going to be learning about how you can acquire different skills without being explicitly taught those particular behaviors, and how this ability to learn without being explicitly taught something can allow us to better adapt to our environments. The 6th edition TCO item that will be covered within this lecture will be from section G on behavior change procedures. More specifically, we'll be focusing on G6, which is develop and implement modeling procedures. Okay, so let's talk about what imitation is and why imitation is important. Imitation, in a very general sense, in a very basic sense, is when a person sees someone else engaging in a behavior and they copy that behavior. But now there are 4 criteria that must be met in order for something to be considered imitative behavior, and we're going to talk about that. But before we do look at those 4 criteria, I want to make sure that I talk to you guys about why imitation is important. All right, so why is imitation important? Okay, why is this a skill that we want to teach people to engage in? And in order to answer this question, I want you first to do some self-reflection. I want you guys to think about your own personal behavior. How many different behaviors can you engage in? Right? Think about, like, try to quantify it. Are you able to engage in 1,000 behaviors? Are you able to engage in, 50,000? Like, what's the number, right? All right, I'll give you a second. Okay. We'll come back. So I doubt that many of you were able to come up with an actual number. It's impossible really to quantify the amount of different behaviors that we are able to engage in, or the different behaviors that we each have in our own personal repertoires. And if you really think about how you acquired all of these different skills throughout your life, it's not likely that the majority of you acquired these skills through explicit instruction, through someone explicitly teaching you to engage in every single one of these behaviors. The majority of, or not the majority, but a big portion of the behaviors that you are able to engage in, now as adults, you likely acquired through some form of imitation. So you were probably in a situation where you were in a novel situation, a new situation that you had never experienced before, and you might have looked around at your peers, or you might have looked around at other people in that particular setting to see how they were behaving. And by watching how those other people were behaving, you modified your own behavior to imitate or to look similar to what that other person was doing. And by doing this, you acquired a new skill, okay? For example, think of children that are in a playground playing, a brand new game. Only one person knows how to play the game. Everyone else has never played this game before. Let's say that the game involves kicking a ball and then trying to get it to land inside of a basket. Most people will probably receive instruction from the person that knows how to play the game. But let's say that you joined the game late and then you're not sure how to play the game. You could look at your peers and see what they're doing to try to learn how to play this game. So you approach the ball, you see what they've been doing. They've been kicking the ball and trying to get it in the basket. So you approach the ball and you do the same thing that they did. No one explicitly taught you this skill. No one gave you direct instruction on how to do this skill. You simply observed what they were doing and you practiced the skill yourself. Okay? This repertoire, right? Being able to imitate allowed you to acquire a new skill. So it's important to have an imitative repertoire, to be able to have the skill to engage in imitative behavior so that we can learn new skills without having to be taught, and so that we can adapt to our environments, so that we can modify our own behaviors to better fit what's going on in that particular environment. If you walk into a room and you see people are being quiet, you should be able to observe that people are being quiet and copy that behavior, If you walk into a room where everyone is quiet and you're being super loud, well, you might be met with some punishment in the form of stares. Maybe someone will tell you, hey, be quiet, different things that might occur. So it's really important for us to have an imitative repertoire, to be able to engage in imitative behavior, so that we are able to better adapt to our environment. But not only that, it's also for the purpose of us to acquire new skills without having to explicitly be taught those skills. Because if we need to explicitly be taught every single behavior that we engage in throughout our lives, then we're going to really be capping the amount of behaviors that we can engage in. So this all goes to say that it's really important that all of the different individuals that we work with have the ability to engage in imitative behavior, okay? And that they can develop a strong imitative repertoire. And not only that, but that they're able to imitate a variety of models that they have been exposed to and some that they have not been exposed to. So we'll talk about that. There's a very particular term. It's called generalized imitative behavior. That's essentially what we really want our clients to have. It's what the majority of you guys in my class most likely have. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later in this lecture. But for now, let's keep going with our discussion on what imitation is. And let's look at those 4 criteria for imitative behavior. Okay, so the first part of the definition, for the technical definition for imitative behavior, says that imitative behavior is occasioned by another person's model of the behavior. So this behavior occurs because they observe another model, another person engaging in a particular model, or a person engaging in a particular behavior. And a model is an antecedent stimulus with topographical similarity to the behavior that is going to be imitated. So if you guys think about the A, B, and C, the contingency, right, of behavior, the model is the antecedent stimulus, okay? So we have our antecedent stimulus, which is the model. We have the response, which is the imitative behavior. The imitative behavior is going to look exactly like that model. Okay, and then we have our consequence, whatever that consequence may be. So in the case with imitative behavior, there has to be a model, that's the antecedent stimulus, that looks topographically similar to the response. Okay, that's something that you guys need to keep in mind. And then these models can be categorized into 2 different categories. They can be planned models, or they can be unplanned models. An example of a planned model is basically something that you are explicitly being taught or instructed to do. So an example would be like a Zumba class where a person is standing in front of an audience, and they are telling you, do this. Or they're telling, at the beginning, at the beginning of the class, they might have said, okay, I'm going to demonstrate the dance moves for so-and-so song, copy along with me. And then the class goes ahead and they follow those steps that the instructor is modeling. So a Zumba class is an example of a planned model. If I have a client that I'm working with that does not know how to brush their teeth, and I wanted to use video modeling, meaning that there's a video playing with someone demonstrating the skill of how to brush your teeth, and they're going step by step and demonstrating what that skill looks like, this is also an example of a planned model. I am explicitly instructing the individual to engage in the different steps of a behavior chain, okay? Models can also be unplanned models. So an unplanned model would be like, if I'm just going about my day-to-day and my son sees me pour some water in a plant, and then he comes right after me and he also pours some water in a plant. This is not something that I ever instructed him to do. He simply observed me doing this and he went ahead and did it himself. So that's an example of an unplanned model. It is seen in typical child development. Another example I have here on the slide for you guys is a dad that's shaving and the child is shaving also. This picture is very likely, we don't really know the context, but if the dad gave the child the spoon and was like, hey, I'm going to shave, do this with me, and he explicitly told him to shave along with him, he said, do this, and told him to copy him, then that would be a planned model. But if the dad was just simply shaving, going about his day, and the son walks over with a spoon and starts to put some shaving cream on and shaving the cream off with a spoon, then that would be an unplanned model. So we do need information about the context, but essentially the planned model is something where there's like explicit instruction. You might tell a person, do this or copy me, and it was something that was planned, whereas an unplanned model, you didn't plan for it, the person simply imitated the behavior. The example that I gave earlier, where you walk into a room and you look at how people are behaving in order to know how you should be behaving, that's typically an example of an unplanned model. Okay, so the next criteria for a behavior to qualify as imitative behavior is that the behavior has to have formal similarity with the model. So if you recall, I mentioned there's the A, B, and C, right? The antecedent stimulus is the model. The response is a copy of the model, right? You're engaging in the same response that you observed. And then we have a consequence. Well, this response needs to have formal similarity with the model. And so formal similarity occurs when the models and the imitator's behavior physically resemble each other and are in the same mode or in the same modality, meaning they look or they sound alike. So if the antecedent stimulus was of like a motor movement, let's say that the person claps their hands, the person that's modeling behavior claps their hands, and the person that is engaging in the behavior claps their hands as well, they are in the same modality, okay? If the person that's engaging in the model claps their hands and the person that's responding just makes a sound like if they were clapping their hands, but they don't actually clap their hands and it doesn't look like the exact same physical movement, then that would not classify as imitation. Okay, the next requirement for something to qualify as imitative behavior is that the behavior that is modeled must have a close temporal relationship to the behavior that the individual is engaging in. So it can't be that a person engaged in a behavior today, and then, let's say that a child saw his dad shaving his beard, and then 5 days later picks up a spoon and starts trying to shave his beard himself. That would qualify as imitative behavior because the temporal relationship between the modeled behavior and then the individual's behavior is too long. And so it's difficult to know whether the control is coming from the model itself or if it's something else that happened in between the time in which the behavior was modeled and the behavior occurred. Okay, there could have been someone that gave an instruction. There could have been a lot of different contingencies at play. And so it's really difficult to know whether the model was truly controlling the behavior. And so because of that, we don't consider, or the textbook definition or the technical definition of imitative behavior is that behavior has to occur really close in time to the modeled behavior, okay? So the final set of criteria that needs to be met in order for a behavior to qualify as imitative behavior is that the behavior must be controlled by the model, meaning that the model is what is evoking the response from the individual. So what this means is that simply doing the same thing as another person is not enough for that behavior to qualify as an imitative response, okay? The controlling behavior has to be the model, which means that behavior that has already come into contact with reinforcement does not qualify as imitative behavior. So for example, if Johnny is imitating his dad shaving, let's say that this is Johnny and Johnny's imitating his dad shaving, and then he is met with reinforcement, right? That's the consequence that follows. Let's say his mom and his dad praise him. You're so cute. That's bright. That's shaving. You were shaving just like daddy. In the future, it's difficult to know if he engages in the response of copying his dad's shaving to simply imitate the behavior, or if he's engaging in that response because he has received reinforcement for that particular response in the future. So imitative behavior has to be controlled by the model. It cannot be behavior that's controlled by the consequence. So this means that an imitative behavior is a new behavior that follows a novel antecedent event. Okay, so it has to be a new behavior that is occurring because of a novel stimulus that was presented. So the shaving, shaving no longer will qualify. But if Johnny sees his dad put a dish in the dishwasher for the very first time, or not for the first time, he sees his dad put the dish in the dishwasher, and let's say he's never copied that behavior. If he puts the dish in the dishwasher right after him, then that is that would qualify as imitative behavior because it's the model that's controlling the behavior. What this means is this type of behavior that is primarily controlled by the model that has not come into contact with reinforcement is considered true imitation because it meets the four criteria that are set for something to qualify as imitative behavior, meaning that it's occasioned by a person's model, it has formal similarity with the model, it follows the same modality, and then it's primarily controlled by the model. But behavior that is controlled already by reinforcement because it's come into contact by reinforcement, the behavior is going to continue to occur because it's come into contact with reinforcement, right? So what ends up happening is that model becomes a discriminative stimulus, and the response becomes a discriminative operant. And so the person is not responding anymore because of just the model, right? The model is not it's not controlling the behavior. What's happening is that model becomes a discriminative stimulus, and it's really reinforcement that's controlling the behavior. So we would call that behavior a discriminated operant. And that's necessary behavior anyways, right? It's behavior that we need to engage in anyways, and there's really nothing wrong with that. But the true definition for imitation or imitative behavior must meet these four criteria that are on this slide. Okay, now, when you are teaching a person a skill that resembles imitation, it doesn't mean that you're going to be like, oh, that's not imitative behavior, right? You still have to teach the person to imitate, and the controlling factors are going to be slightly different, right? If you're teaching a person to engage in imitative behavior when they don't have that repertoire naturally, when they don't have that skill naturally, it's still necessary for us to teach them these skills. But the controlling variables are going to look slightly different. The controlling variables are going to look like that SD response consequence, right? That model is not going to be the controlling factor because for some people, imitation does not come naturally. For some people, they need to be explicitly taught to engage in imitation, right? A lot of the children that I work with have developmental disabilities. Some of them have great imitative repertoires, and then some do not. Some come to us without the ability to copy a model. And so for these individuals, the model is not the controlling variable. And that's a problem because I want them to have, or not I want them, but they should have an imitative repertoire so that they can acquire new skills, so that they can adapt to their social environment, so that they can learn communicative responses without having to be explicitly taught certain responses, so that they can participate in activities with their peers for so many different reasons. But it's so important for us to not focus on the technical definition for imitative behavior, because when we are teaching a person to engage in imitation, that model is not controlling their response. It's really at that point they've come into contact with reinforcement. We're trying to shape up a new behavior. We're trying to get them to engage in imitation. So it's really the reinforcement that's going to be controlling their responses, not the model. And that's okay. I'm not going to sit there and say, oh, this is not a form of imitation, right? it's still a necessary skill for them to have, and I'm going to teach them the skill, and eventually I'll try to get to a point where the person can acquire skills with the model being the primary form of control, right? I want them to eventually not have to rely on me explicitly teaching them a skill, not have to rely on me reinforcing every single instance of them copying a model. I want them to get to a point to where eventually they can see a person engage in a response in their environment, and they themselves can copy that response, and for the model to be the controlling variable. So this leads us into our next topic, which is imitation training. Imitation training is when we teach a person in a very systematic way to copy models. Okay, this is for individuals who don't have an imitative repertoire already, or maybe they do have an imitative repertoire, but it's limited in capacity. Maybe they don't naturally imitate all forms of behavior. Maybe they can only engage in simple imitation, like one-step imitation, like clap your hands, well, I wouldn't give the instruction, clap your hands. I would say, do this, and then I would clap my hands. But essentially with imitation training, what we are trying to do is, in a very systematic way, we are going to teach those non-imitative learners to imitate models of novel behavior. Of course, this is going to be done, like I said, through providing a model, helping them out by prompting in some way so that they can copy that behavior. And then I'm going to deliver reinforcement. And we'll go through, this is like me talking about it in a general sense. I'm going to break it down for you guys. I'm going to talk about some prerequisite skills that the individuals must have and all of that. And I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit more about what imitation training would look like. But I'm trying to give you guys a general sense of what imitation training is and the purpose for imitation training, okay? And like I said in the previous slide, imitation, by definition, is controlled by the model. But for people who don't have an imitative repertoire, the imitation for them is not controlled by the model to begin with. So when we are engaging in imitation training, we are essentially teaching them to engage in imitation. We're going to reinforce those responses, and then eventually we want to get them to a point where the model itself is going to be controlling their responses. So what this means is that the objective is to teach learners to copy a model regardless of what is being modeled. So this means that initially I might have to teach particular skills. I might have a set list of instructions that I want to teach them to follow. It might be I want to teach them to push a car. I want to teach them to open a door. I want to teach them to clap their hands, to smile when I smile. I want to teach them to, blow bubbles. It could be so many different things. I might have a specific list of targets that I want to teach, but I'm not going to restrict myself or limit my learner to that particular list of skills that I have there. I see this all the time when I'm working with clients. I'll provide my therapist with a list of targets that they should teach the learner to engage in, and the therapist will teach the learner to engage in all the different skills. Let's say it's a list of 10 targets. And then once they hit the 10 targets, they're like, okay, perfect. This child has mastered the imitation program, and now they have an imitative repertoire. And they don't realize that, when you are teaching a learner to engage in skills that are part of a target list, what essentially you've taught them is to engage in just those responses. But we need to make sure that that the effects of our teaching are extending far beyond target lists, okay? Target lists are just that. It's just a list of targets, but we want this person to be successful in all of their environments. We want them to be able to, walk into a room, see what a person is doing, and be able to adapt to what that person is doing, or maybe copy what that person is doing so that they can adapt to that particular environment. And teaching a person to simply follow a target list is not going to achieve that. So I try to, teach my therapists to be critical thinkers, to go far beyond a target list. Sure, you taught them to engage in these particular responses, these particular behaviors, but do they have the ability to imitate novel things? Can you be goofy in front of them and tell them, hey, copy me as I'm being goofy, and can they do all of the silly things that you are doing? If they're able to, then that is excellent. That's exactly what we want to achieve, right? But if they're not able to, well, then there's a disconnect, right? We've taught them to imitate the responses on the list, and those responses are going to continue to occur because guess what's happened? You've provided reinforcement for those responses. So those responses are going to be maintained by that reinforcement you've been providing. They're going to continue to occur in the future because they've contacted reinforcement. But those novel responses, you being goofy, you being silly and modeling something silly, might not be occurring because the imitative behaviors are being controlled by the reinforcement, and that control has not yet transferred to the model. We need to teach individuals to engage in imitative behavior when they see a novel model, not just those things that we've explicitly taught. So what this means is that the goal, okay, of all of your imitation programs that you have or that you're working on should always be generalized imitation. And generalized imitation is when a learner can imitate a variety of untrained, unprompted, and novel models in different settings, with different people, in different situations, right? We want people to be able to see something that occurs in their environment and be like, I'm going to do the same thing. And they just do the same thing, regardless of the consequence that follows, okay? If you're able to see a model and copy that model without having any prior experience with that model, that means that you have a generalized imitative repertoire. And I'm not talking about just being able to do it with one or two actions. I'm talking about being able to do it with, hundreds of different actions. If I stand in front of you and I touch my nose, and let's say I tell you to just copy everything that I do, and I touch my nose and you touch your nose, and then I touch my hair and then you touch your hair, and then I, wiggle my arms like a chicken, and then you wiggle your arms like a chicken. And maybe I type something on my computer and you type the exact same thing on your computer. Well, that means if you have never copied those particular responses before, I've never explicitly taught you to engage in those particular responses, that means that you have a generalized imitative repertoire. So when I'm working with a client and I want to see what my client's abilities are, really what I'm searching for is I want to see if this person has a generalized imitative repertoire. So I'll go in there and I'll sit with my client and I'll just do a bunch of usually silly things that just don't make sense, and I'll ask them to copy me. I'll say, hey, do what I'm doing, and I'll see, can they copy all of the silly things that I do without me giving like a very explicit instruction and saying do this and sitting perfectly in front of them and like in a perfect environment, and then them copying me, because perfection is not what they're going to come into contact with in their natural environment. You have to think about your own situations that you've been exposed to in your lives. When you go to a new job, a lot of new jobs will train you by simply having you observe someone else and do exactly what they do, okay? If you're able to do that, then you very likely have a generalized imitative repertoire. If you're not able to do that and someone has to sit there and explicitly teach you every single skill, then that's going to be cumbersome. And it's going to be difficult, and maybe you won't be able to maintain that job. And so that's why I say that really the goal of imitation training is always going to be able to have a generalized imitative repertoire eventually, to be able to respond to novel, to untrained, unprompted models. Okay. These generalized imitative behaviors really do, like I said throughout this entire lecture, allow us to better adapt to all of our environments. It's important for you to, let's say that you walk into a room and you see that everyone is frowning, everyone is sad, and you walk in and you're all giddy and you're happy, and you don't change your way of like being to kind of match that mood, to kind of figure out what's going on, then like I said, you're going to be met with maybe punishment. You're going to be met with like people looking at you weirdly, like, hey, did you not see that something just happened to so-and-so? And then you're going to be like, oh my goodness, so I'm sorry, I didn't realize. But if you're able to pick up on those social cues, then you can adapt to that particular environment. You'll be more successful in social interactions and communication with individuals and so on and so forth. All right, so let's go back to imitation training. Let's say that you've identified a learner that does not have a strong imitative repertoire, or they don't have an imitative repertoire at all, and you say, okay, I want to teach this individual to engage in imitation. There are a few prerequisite skills that you need to make sure that your learner has before beginning imitation training, okay? The main thing really is that the learner needs to be able to attend to a model. They need to be able to see the model. They need to be able to, I guess we can define what attending means. They need to be able to stay seated during the instruction, or not necessarily seated, because you can do, you can have a person copy a model when you're standing, but they basically need to be able to orient themselves towards you. Or towards the instructor, whoever the instructor is. And then if you're going to be doing some form of imitation training that involves objects, then they need to be able to look at the objects that you're showing them and attend to the objects that you are showing them. If the learner does not have these particular prerequisite skills, then you want to make sure that you teach them the prerequisite skills before jumping in maybe and working on imitation. Or you can try to work on imitation alongside with teaching these particular skills. It just might make imitation a little bit harder. One thing that I want to mention is that when you are doing imitation training, make sure that your learner is looking at the model. I cannot tell you how many times I've worked with a therapist and they are presenting an instruction, and it's not just an imitative instruction, but just an instruction in general, and the learner is not attending. They're not looking at the person that's providing the model. They're not maybe looking at the material that you're providing them with. And so they're, the therapist will say, do this. And then they'll roll the car on the table, but the client is looking up at a corner in the room. And so when the client doesn't copy the model because they didn't see the model, the therapist is then going ahead and they're prompting the skill, and they're having the learner engage in the response. And then they're marking it as they got it incorrect, or they needed to be prompted to engage in the skill. But really, the learner didn't get a good opportunity to see the model. So, like I mentioned, if we want to eventually get for the learner's behavior to come under the control of a model, then we need to make sure that they are attending to models, right? So that when we reinforce these responses and eventually their imitative repertoire grows, so that eventually they're able to see novel models and copy those models. But if you're not setting up a good trial for them, where they are getting the opportunity to look at a model, to attend to a model, you're not gaining their attention first, then you're setting them up for failure. So make sure that you do get their attention first, and that they are oriented towards you, and that they are oriented towards the object if you're going to be using some form of objects. All right, so let's continue with our discussion on imitation training. You've determined, that the learner has the prerequisite skills to engage in imitation training. So now you want to figure out to what extent can this individual imitate, okay? So you will probably run an assessment of some sort. There are a lot of different assessments available, but you're going to want to assess whether the individual is able to imitate with objects. Are they able to imitate without objects? To what extent can they imitate with objects, right? To what extent can they imitate with their body? You basically want to get a sense for what they can and cannot do in terms of the types of imitation that they can engage in. And then in addition, you want to look at the complexity of their current imitative repertoire. So like I said, some people that you are going to be working on imitation training with them, it's not that they don't have an imitative repertoire. They might have an imitative repertoire, but it's very limited in scope. And so for those individuals that have very limited imitative repertoires, you might want to work on increasing the complexity of their imitative repertoire, okay? So for example, you want to ask, or you want to check or assess, does this person engage in one-step imitation? Meaning, if you just simply tell them to clap their hands, I'm sorry, not tell them, but show them you clapping your hands, do they clap their hands along with you, right? Are they able to follow that one-step imitation? Or are they able to do more complex things, like you modeling how to open a door by putting in the key, turning the knob, turning the key, and then turning the knob to get through the door, right? That's a more complex form of an imitation that you can possibly teach an individual to engage in. Toothbrushing is another form of complex imitation, right? It's an entire behavior chain that they would have to learn, with a lot of different steps involved, different topographical responses involved. So that's another example of complex imitation that we could teach. So what is your learner capable of? Are they capable of single-step imitation? Are they capable of two-step imitation, or a more complex imitation, right? You need to assess all of these different repertoires to get a sense for where your learner is. Once you figure out where they are, what they're capable of, then you want to either start exactly at the point where they're capable of. Sometimes you might choose to start slightly below. So if they're able to, you can see that they have, let's say, 2 or 3 examples of two-step imitation that they can engage in, but it's not strong enough, it's not very consistent, then you might want to consider starting a little bit lower and do some one-step imitation, really strengthen that repertoire, and then push into two-step imitation once you've strengthened that repertoire. Sometimes you see that they have a very strong one-step imitation. They're able to imitate every single time you model a behavior that is only one step, and they're very consistent with that. But maybe they're not able to do any two-step imitation. Oh, another thing is that maybe there's a lot of variability. They can imitate a lot of different one-step instructions. Then at that point, you might want to look at introducing two-step imitation, where they imitate, maybe like picking up a brush and brushing their hair. I don't know, it could be different too. I'm trying to think of functional things, because you always, or as much as possible, you want to try to teach at functional instructions, so that they're able to use those in their environment, rather than teaching random arbitrary things like, touch your head and tap your nose. That when would they ever need to do those things, right? So as much as possible, you want to teach functional skills. It's not to say that you're not going to sometimes do random arbitrary instructions. Maybe you will. So there's not really like a specific guideline that I can give you in terms of figuring out where you want to place your learner. But you generally want to see, is there enough variability in the repertoire? Are they able to engage in enough different skills? Is there a lot of one-step imitation that they can consistently do, or is it inconsistent, meaning that sometimes I present a model, a one-step imitation model, and sometimes they respond, but sometimes they don't? If that's the case, then you typically want to stay at that step for a little bit longer until they can consistently demonstrate that they have that skill. You don't want to advance too soon into something more complex or something a little bit more difficult when they don't have a good foundation. I'm a very big proponent of having a strong foundation, setting a very strong foundation before we advance to more complex skills. Sometimes caregivers, they get excited and they're like, oh no, but he can engage in two-step imitation. I've seen him, he's done it with 2 things before, right? And you can explain to them, yes, they do have the ability to engage in two-step imitation, and that's great. We want to make sure that we strengthen that repertoire, but first let's make sure we strengthen the one-step imitation, set a really solid foundation for them before we move into something a little bit more complex. So sometimes you have to have those difficult conversations with caregivers where you say, you're right, they can engage in a few of these two-step imitation, but their one-step imitation is still inconsistent. So let's focus on strengthening that first. It's easier for them, less response effort, and then we'll move into something a little bit more complex. So like I mentioned, there really isn't a specific guideline for how to figure out where to be, but use your critical thinking skills. Think about everything I just discussed with you in the last few minutes, and you will figure out a proper placement for your learner. And if you have a hard time figuring out a proper placement as a BCABA, then you want to consult with your BCBA that is supervising you, and they can definitely guide you on figuring out a proper placement for your learner. Okay. All right. So let's say now you have figured out the proper placement for your learner. You figured out to what extent they can imitate, and you know that you want to work on one-step imitation. You want to then go ahead and, probe. And by probe, I mean test. That's what I mean by test. It's like a little pre-test of some sort. I call it probe. A lot of the practitioners in our field call this probing. It's basically you probe to see where the learner is. You want to see what skills they have or do not have in their repertoire, and this helps you to determine what particular target you want to work on. So you've decided you want to work on one-step imitation. Now let's probe to see which skills they do have in their repertoire, which ones do they not have in their repertoire, and let's decide on what we want to work on. So let's talk about the steps to do this. So the first thing you might want to do is to have a list of different targets that you want to test. Remember, I mentioned earlier, you don't want to only teach things that are on a target list, okay? So once the person masters everything on the target list, you want to test for, do they have generalized imitation, right? Are they able to imitate novel behaviors? You don't want to basically master everything on a list and be like, all right, perfect, great, they can imitate. Let's move on to something more complex. Let's move on to two-step imitation, or let's move on to, I don't know, anything a little bit more complex than that. Because simply because they've mastered the target list does not mean that they have a strong enough repertoire or a consistent enough repertoire for you to advance into something more complex, okay? So keep that in mind. Anyways, we'll come back to this. So when you are probing, you want to possibly have a target list that you are probing from. You can definitely come up with targets on your own. There are lists that different assessments provide. You can pay for lists on the internet. I don't think you need to do all of that. You can just come up with instructions on your own, and it's really helpful to have functional instructions, okay? And by functional, I mean things that they are likely to have to do in their day-to-day lives, okay? So next, you have decided that you are going to test, let's say, the skill of clapping your hands. Let's say that's the target. So clapping your hands. So you're going to say, do this, and then you're going to model the behavior. So you're going to say, do this, and that's basically your whole model. That's your SD. And then they should either engage in the response with formal similarity immediately after you present your model, and it should be in the exact same modality. Nothing should be changing, right? If they do, then you're going to collect data on that. You're going to say, yes, they engage in this behavior independently, or you're going to say, no, they did not engage in this behavior, or maybe they engaged in part of the response, but it wasn't perfect. It didn't have that formal similarity, so you're still going to say no. And you're going to collect data on that. And all you're going to do is you are going to test to see whether they can engage in this skill or not engage in this skill. At this phase, right, and when we are just probing to see if a person has a skill, we're not going to be prompting. We're not teaching the person to engage in this skill at that particular moment. We're just testing. Can they engage in this behavior or not? And the reason we don't want to prompt at this particular point is because by prompting, we might inadvertently be teaching the skill, and so we won't have the ability to test whether they really are engaging in the response because they have the response in their repertoire, or is it because you just prompted the response, so in the future when you try to test for it again, they are engaging in the response, okay? So we want to have, some like stimulus control. We want to be able to show that they're engaging in the response simply because you presented the model and not because you're prompting the response. Okay. So you're going to follow company protocol on how many times you're supposed to be probing a skill. Most people are going to be asking you to probe a skill 3 times. You're going to collect data, and it could be different times. It's not like you're going to be modeling clapping your hands one right after the other. It could be like you run a trial on clapping your hands, and then maybe you run a trial on, opening the faucet. Maybe then you run a trial on pushing your car, and then maybe you come back to clapping your hands to see if they can clap their hands. Okay, so you're going to run 3 different trials of that particular target to see whether they can consistently demonstrate that they have that response in their repertoire. If they engage in the response 3 out of 3 times, that means that it generally means that they do have that response in their repertoire. It's a pretty strong and consistent response, and you can move on. You don't need to teach that particular skill. So what we are looking for when we are probing responses is whether the individual can engage in that response consistently, or do they not engage in it consistently, and should we teach this response. I mentioned here to make sure that you're following your company protocol on how many times to probe a skill, because every single company has different protocols. Some will do 3 times, some will do 2 times, some will do even just 1 time. And then 1 time is enough for them to say, hey, let's teach this particular skill. So just do whatever it is that your company is instructing you to do. And yeah, the big idea here is that you want to make sure that you are simply testing to see what skills are in their repertoire and what are not. I don't know if I mentioned this point already or not, but you want to make sure that you are also not providing reinforcement, not just that you're not prompting the skill, but that you're not providing specific reinforcement for the behavior that they are engaging in. So let's say that I present the model for clapping your hands. I say, do this, and I clap my hands, and let's say that they clap their hands too. I don't want to provide reinforcement, because at this stage, I'm simply testing whether they have the skill or not, and I don't want that to affect any of the other targets that I'm teaching or that I'm going to be testing for. So I'm not going to provide reinforcement for their particular response. I'm going to say, thanks, or okay, great, here's a little break, or whatever. But my reinforcement is not going to be specific to their response. Similarly, if they give me an incorrect response, I am still going to provide reinforcement. That's why I'm saying don't provide specific reinforcement for the response. You're going to provide non-contingent reinforcement. Okay, so after they engage in the response, whatever that response is, whether it's correct or not, you are going to say, all right, thanks for responding. Or you probably won't say thanks for responding, but you're going to say, great, here's a break, or here, you can play with this now, or okay, that looked good. Even if it was wrong, it doesn't matter. At this phase, we are just testing to see if they have the skill or do not have the skill. There's going to be a phase where we do teach, and when we are teaching, then we want to look for that correct response. We want to prompt the correct response and reinforce their correct response. But at this phase, when we are testing, we don't prompt the skill, and we just provide reinforcement regardless of whether the response is correct or not. Okay. And then there's just one thing that I added on here. You're not going to see this in your textbook, but it's something that I see often in practice. And I want to make sure that I'm letting you guys, or I'm relaying this information to you guys. When you are working on imitation, you remember the response is going to be controlled by the model. And in imitation training, we always say, do this, copy me, or do what I do. Do the same thing as me, whatever it is, whatever verbal stimulus it is that I'm going to present along with the model. When you are running imitation, you are not going to be saying the instruction. Okay, so what this means is, if I'm clapping my hands, I'm going to say, do this, and I'm going to clap my hands. But I am not going to say, clap your hands, and then I clap my hands, okay? Those are 2 very different things. I'm going to say, do this, and then I'm going to present the model, which is me clapping my hands. I am not going to say, clap your hands. I'm not going to give them the instruction, because that is a completely different operant. When we are working on imitation, we need to make sure that we are saying, do this, copy me, do what I do, and then that we are, imitation training, and then that we are presenting that model along with it, okay? So do not say the instruction. I train therapists all the time. I actually love to train therapists. One of the big things that I find that people struggle with is when they're working on imitation trials, they are saying the instruction. Don't say the instruction, simply model it and say, copy me, do this, do what I do, copy what I'm doing, whatever variation of that you want to use, okay? Okay, so now let's look at this flow chart for how you should run an imitation training session. Obviously, this is going to look different depending on your learner. This is just a general guide. But in general, you want to follow some steps similar to this. I also want to mention that every single company that you work for is going to have different expectations for how they want you to address a prompted response versus an incorrect response. So keep that in mind. This isn't like a perfect guide. It's just a sample guide. Okay, so when you are running an imitation training session, I mentioned this earlier, you want to make sure that you have the learner's attention. So make sure the learning is attending. You want him to be oriented towards you and looking at the learning material if you are incorporating any learning material. This does not mean you're going to force eye contact or anything like that. Just make sure that they are, in a general sense, looking in your direction and like ready to learn, essentially. Okay, next you're going to present your SD, which is going to be that verbal SD, such as do this or copy me, do the same thing that I'm doing, whatever variation of that you want to use. Okay, and then along with that that verbal SD, you're going to present your model. Okay, so you will model the skill that the learner is supposed to engage in. And then the learner will respond in different ways. The learner may respond correctly. So if they do respond correctly and independently, then you're going to reinforce that response with high magnitude. You want them to know that what they did was the correct thing. This could look like providing praise. Maybe you provide access to a preferred item that they enjoy engaging with. Or you yourself engage in an activity with them. Okay, you're going to be combining a variety of different types of reinforcers. If the learner, does not give a correct response and they instead give an incorrect response, so you presented your model of, let's say it was clapping their hands, and instead of them clapping their hands, they stomp their feet, which is an incorrect response, you're going to present the SD again, and you're going to model again the skill that you want them to practice, and then you're going to prompt them to engage in that response. Okay, so once they make an incorrect response, you're not going to prompt the correct response right after. You have to insert the SD again. You need to present the SD again so that the learner is learning to respond after the model and the SD, rather than the learner here's the SD, you model the skill, they make an incorrect response, and then you prompt the correct response. We don't want them to learn a chain of responses that are incorrect, right? I don't want the learner to let's say that I'm teaching them to clap their hands, and I say, okay, do this, and I clap my hands, and then they stomp their feet instead. I don't want to then prompt them to clap their hands right after having stomped their feet, because if I reinforce that prompted response, what's going to happen is really I'm reinforcing a chain of responses. I'm reinforcing an incorrect response, which is the foot stomping, and then the prompted response. So I would be reinforcing the foot stomping and then the clapping of the hands, which is not the response really that we are looking for. The response that we're looking for is that following the SD and the model, they're going to just clap their hands the same way that I clapped my hands. So in that case, it's very important that after an incorrect response, we are representing the SD and the model again, so that we're not reinforcing a chain of incorrect response and then a prompted response. We want to represent the SD and then prompt the response and then reinforce that prompted response. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing. If it was a little bit confusing, just go back and hear this portion of the recording again. The general idea is that we don't want to reinforce chained responses of an incorrect response and then a prompted response. We really want the learner to understand that they should be seeing a model and then responding right after that model. Okay. So also, again, we want the control to be coming from the model. And then finally, another option could be that when you initially present the trial, the learner maybe doesn't respond, and so you immediately prompt that learner. So maybe you wait 2 to 3 seconds for them to respond. You see that they didn't respond, and so instead you prompt the response. And then in that case, if you did prompt the response, you would still provide some reinforcement. and then eventually fade those prompts out so that eventually they can respond independently to that SD presentation and to the model. Okay, so one thing that I have noticed that I also want to mention is there's a misconception that you only reinforce responses that are correct or that are independent. And again, this is going to be dependent on each learner, and this is going to be dependent on the company that you work for. But in general, we want to provide higher magnitude reinforcers for and high magnitude reinforcements for independent responses. We also want to provide lower magnitude reinforcement for, or moderate magnitude reinforcement for, a prompted response. Okay, it's not to say that, there's that just because you prompted a response, you're not providing reinforcement. Prompted responses should be reinforced anyways, and then eventually you work on gradually fading those prompts so that the learner is able to respond more independently. But it is important that we are shaping up those responses to eventually, teach them to engage in that skill independently. Okay, so now that you've learned a little bit about imitation training, let's talk about modeling. So modeling is a behavior change strategy in which learners acquire a skill by imitating demonstrations of the skill. So I talked to you guys specifically about imitation training, which is when we very specifically try to teach a skill in a very contrived manner. An imitation, you basically are trying to build an imitative repertoire, and you're teaching those particular skills in a very contrived manner. We can use modeling, though, to teach a variety of skills. And modeling is something that's used in our day-to-day lives, and we might not even recognize that modeling is being used, okay? And like I mentioned, modeling is when we are trying to simply teach a person a new skill by demonstrating what that skill looks like, is the general idea of what this behavior change strategy looks like, okay? And models could be live models, or they can be video models. And you've probably experienced both of these in your own lives, and I have examples for each of these. So an example of a live model could be if you were, let's say, becoming a cashier at a grocery store. Maybe on your first few days on the job, they might have you observing someone else working at the cash register, okay? And that person will demonstrate basically what it is that you are supposed to do on the job. And this is very typical actually in a lot of different employment centers, where they'll have you observe a person engaging in that skill that you are supposed to then be engaging in. They'll have you observe for a few days, or a few hours, whatever it might be, and then they'll have you practice. This is an example of a modeling being used to teach you the skills that are necessary for you to be able to be successful in that new job of yours. Then we have, and live models can be used all the time. I mean, I can model how to tie a shoe in person, right, in vivo, where I maybe have a learner sitting right next to me who is going to practice shoe tying, and so I might have my own shoe and they have their own shoe, and in person I'm modeling and I'm demonstrating what that skill looks like, and then they're following along with me. Okay, then we can also have video models, and video models, again, they're not just used in our day-to-day practice as behavior analysts. They're used in any aspect of our lives. YouTube is great for this. There are tons of great videos on YouTube to model particular skills for individuals. If you are going and you are learning, let's say, I'll give you an example. My microwave recently broke. The keypad on my microwave recently broke. And my husband, he was going on YouTube to try to find videos on how to fix this particular part of the microwave, the keypad. And so he was following the video guide, right? The video serves as a model, which is demonstrating the skill that he then has to engage in. And so he was then going and he was following along with the video. That is an example of a video model. We sometimes, in behavior analysis, and it's used, I would say it's used fairly often, but it's not like you're going to use it with every single client. This is dependent on how your learner learns. But we'll have clients that you work with that you're going to have to create video models for them, because video models are effective strategies for teaching new behaviors. And so basically you will record yourself, or you can record your learner engaging in the particular skill that you want to teach them. Okay. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to task analyze the behavior. You're going to make sure that you demonstrate all of the different steps that you want that learner to be able to engage in. You're going to demonstrate all of those steps in the video, and then you'll show the video to the learner, and they'll practice after you have shown them the video. So there are some guidelines for effective modeling, which will help us to prepare models that are more likely to be copied or imitated by our learners. Okay, and this applies for both live models and video models. So basically, there was some research that was conducted, and they found that the more similar a individual is to the learner, the person that's providing the model is to the learner, the more likely that that learner is to imitate the behavior that they are observing. So this can be, this could be a person that has had a similar past experience. This could be someone that's close in age to the learner that you are working with. So for example, if you're working with a 10-year-old, well, then maybe you can have someone that's similar in age to them provide the model or be the model, or be in the video that you are showing as the model. Okay, it could be the same sex. So if it's a female, then you would want to show a female, and then similar in physical appearance as well. All of these different things help to make the model a little bit more effective and more likely for the person, the learner, to imitate that particular behavior. There's an example in your textbook that says, if imitation is used to teach a teenager how to reduce drug use, a person who has successfully gone straight might serve as an effective model more so than someone who has not. I have had a similar experience in my practice. In my early years as a behavior analyst, I had a child that we were working with to teach we were teaching him how to engage in like deep breaths in order to relax himself. And it was difficult for him to imitate it when we would show it to him in a live model. And so my boss suggested, well, what if I have my daughter engage in an entire relaxation routine and we show it to him? And so my boss asked her daughter to serve as the model. I think they were really similar in age. Both of them at the time were around 6 or 7. And so my boss sent over a video. It was about a 1-minute long video. And what we would do was we would play this video for my client, and he would follow along with my boss's daughter, which was in the video model. And he would actually imitate it much better than if we practiced it in person with him. And so this is an example of someone that is similar to our learner serving as a model, and him, more effectively being able to imitate that behavior. So that model was a more effective model because it was similar in age to him. Similarly, people that have a more prestigious appearance or that are higher in social status tend to also increase the likelihood of imitative behavior for learners. And this isn't only just for learners, but if you think about what you experience in your day-to-day lives, social media is very popular nowadays. And what you often see in social media is like this, perfection. You see people that people put out their best selves on social media, and oftentimes people are imitating the behavior of people that they're observing on social media, likely because of a high social status. You're more likely to also imitate the behavior of a person with a high social status, right? Because you maybe want to achieve that social status yourself. There could be different reasons why you might imitate that behavior. For example, I follow different sharks from Shark Tank on my Instagram, and I try to observe the types of behavior that they're engaging in. I try to learn from them, and I, in a sense, imitate some of their behaviors so that I can, learn how to be a businesswoman. I'm not a businesswoman, but I can learn and acquire skills from them that could be useful to me in the future. Next, when preparing a model or when you are presenting a model, you can emphasize the critical aspect of a behavior. And this can look like, this can be presented in a lot of different ways, but essentially what you want to do is when you present your model, you want to exaggerate certain aspects of your model. For example, if you're teaching a child to blow and you want them to look at your face, like to blow a candle, you want them to look at your face, right? And watch as you take a deep breath in. So you might want to be exaggerated when you take your deep breath in. You go, right? You maybe open your eyes big, lift your shoulders up or blow your belly out. And then when you're going to blow out, you can go and make it very exaggerated, like shake your head. This is not necessary for every learner, but there might be some learners that may need this extra cue. Okay, so by emphasizing or exaggerating certain aspects of the behavior, they're more likely to be able to imitate that particular behavior. Another example of this could be when you're teaching a learner play skills. Play skills is like the perfect place to exaggerate certain parts of play routines. And it might be difficult to conceptualize what a play routine is, but a play routine is, if you've never sat down and tried to teach a child how to play. But a play routine is basically a certain chain of behavior, a chain of responses that you engage in while you're playing, and you do that same thing over and over and over and over. It's a routine. Kids love repetition. It's very fun for them. So through repetition, we can teach a lot, okay? So when you are modeling a particular play routine, you can exaggerate certain parts of the routine so that the learner is able to imitate that particular aspect. So let's say that I'm building a tower with a learner, and then at the end, I want them to, knock it down. I can model this particular behavior several times, and I can do it in a very exaggerated way. I can build the tower. Let's say I build it, and then I go, oh no, it's falling over, and I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow this tower down, and then you blow it down, or you don't necessarily blow it down, but you blow it down and you knock it down together. You do it in a very exaggerated way, and that's going to make it fun and interesting for the learner. And so then they're going to go and they're going to imitate that behavior on their own. And maybe you didn't even have to explicitly place a demand because it's just part of play, but you made it so fun. The model was so exaggerated and engaging that they're going to go and they're going to imitate that behavior on their own. So this is something that you can incorporate in different ways. I'm talking about play here. I'm talking about, blowing a candle, but there are so many different skills that we could be teaching where, you could think of, is there a verbal cue that I can exaggerate a little bit more? My facial expression, my hand movement, what is it? What part of this skill that I'm trying to teach can I exaggerate a little bit more to make it more likely for my learner to pick up on what I'm trying to teach them and be able to imitate this particular skill? Keep in mind that exaggeration might not be appropriate for your learner, right? Your learner might be a little bit older, and they might be able to pick up on very subtle cues and not need something so exaggerated or that critical aspect to be emphasized. But there will be learners that will benefit from this. So keep in mind your learner profile, their age, their skill level, how good they are at attending to models, things like that. Another thing you can do to make your model more effective would be to combine the model along with instructions. So imitation can be enhanced when it's combined with instructions. So for example, when you're watching a video model on how to repair the microwave, let's say your microwave broke. This recently happened to me. My microwave broke. I went on YouTube. I found a video of a person that's fixing their microwave, and then I can follow along with them, right? I'm watching the video model, but they can also deliver some vocal instructions, and that will help me to be able to complete the task or to imitate that particular behavior. So we can pair vocal instructions along with our model in order to enhance imitation. Similarly, modeling in the natural context or in the natural environment is going to make it more likely for the learner to be able to imitate that particular skill that you are teaching. So whenever possible, try to incorporate natural models, right? Show them what the behavior looks like in the natural environment. If you're teaching dishwashing, for example, well, you can stand in front of them and you can wash the dishes in front of them, rather than teaching them to wash dishes outside of like an appropriate context, right? It would be more appropriate to teach a person to wash the dishes after they've eaten something and they are they're done eating and now they have to wash their dish. Or they want to eat and the dish is dirty in the sink, so now we can wash the dish and I'll show you what that looks like. Now you try. So try to incorporate natural environment teaching as much as possible. So this would look like you simply modeling the skill in the natural environment, and then they can copy that skill. And then, of course, imitation is always going to be enhanced, just like many other different skills are going to be enhanced when you rehearse. So you can rehearse a skill with the learner several times. You can practice with them. Okay, this is how you would do this particular skill, and then you could show them what that particular skill would look like, and then have them practice. You can provide them with feedback, and then if they do it well, you can provide reinforcement, and you can continue this cycle. You could practice again, so you can rehearse with them again. But anytime that you pair any skill can be taught through rehearsal, providing feedback, and then delivering reinforcement. Okay, now let's discuss observational learning. Observational learning is something that happens. It's a type of way for us to acquire a skill or to learn from our environment without directly experiencing the consequences or the contingencies at play. So this is pretty much where we observe another person engage in behavior. We can see them experiencing certain consequences based off of that behavior that they engage in, and then we ourselves modify our own behavior by observing the consequences that that person received for having engaged in that behavior. This is, like I said, a form of learning, and it can or may not, it may or may not involve imitation, and I'll explain to you why it might not involve imitation. So an example of this occurring in our day-to-day lives, a perfect example of this is in a classroom. Let's say that a teacher asks a question, a student raises their hand, they respond to the question, and it's the incorrect answer. If you had the same answer that you wanted to give, you observed that person give the response that was the incorrect response, right? You probably will not raise your hand and give the same exact response. You might alter your response to provide a different response based off of the feedback that the teacher provided. So you are modifying your behavior. You are learning based off of having observed this person engage in a behavior and having observed the contingency or the consequence that they received for having engaged in that particular behavior. So in this example, you didn't necessarily imitate that person's behavior. You instead modified your own behavior based off of the contingencies that you observed having occurred. There are instances, though, where we might see a person engage in a behavior and receive a positive consequence. Let's say that I am at a neighbor's house and my partner asks for a cup of water, and let's say that I've been really thirsty for a while, and so he asks for a cup of water and the neighbor gives him the cup of water. I might see, he asked for water and he got a cup of water. I'm thirsty too. This worked well for him, so I'm going to ask for a cup of water myself. Where maybe I wouldn't have felt comfortable enough to have requested water, but since he already did it and I saw that he got water, well, now I'll, go ahead and request the water. So this is an example of me learning through imitation, but it's observational learning. I observed him engage in the behavior, observed the consequence that followed. It was a consequence that, maybe I was hoping to obtain, right? I felt motivated for water as well, and so I went ahead and I engaged in the behavior as well. So observational learning is a skill that is great for us to have in our repertoires, for any learner really to have in their repertoire, because it allows us to acquire new skills or to modify our behaviors without having to directly experience those contingencies or those consequences, right? We're not going to learn through trial and error. We're instead going to learn through having observed what another person experienced, and we're going to modify our own behavior in that way. So some people are great with observational learning and some people are not. Some people need to experience contingencies themselves, and so unfortunately it will take them a lot longer to acquire skills. They need to go through that trial and error process. So just because a person doesn't have the necessary skills for engaging in observational learning at a given moment in time doesn't mean that they can't acquire these skills. They can definitely acquire these skills, but there are particular skills that are associated with observational learning that they might need to learn first. So there is one critical aspect for observational learning, and that is that the learner must be able to discriminate the feedback received by the model. This means that they must be able to identify or distinguish between different contingencies, right? They must be able to identify, well, because this person engaged in this particular behavior, they received this particular consequence. So they need to be able to associate those things together. This behavior resulted in this particular consequence. If they don't discriminate between different behaviors and the consequences that are associated with them, then it would be difficult for observational learning to occur and for them to modify their own particular behaviors because they are not associating behaviors with particular consequences that would follow. So as I mentioned, observational learning really is a critical aspect in order to be able to acquire new skills without having to directly come into contact with the particular contingencies that are associated with specific behaviors. So children that don't have observational learning repertoires, they can learn new behaviors, they can acquire new skills, but they will only acquire them through direct instruction. They need to directly engage in the behavior, experience the contingencies or the consequences that follow, and then learn through that process of experiencing the contingencies. So this is, of course, very time consuming and very expensive. And it will take, like I said, it's time consuming. It's going to take a lot longer for them to acquire particular skills because of this trial and error process. There are three requisite skills that have been identified in order for a person to be able to develop this observational learning repertoire. And this is that the person must be able to attend, they must be able to imitate, and they must be able to discriminate. So if a learner does not have any of these requisite skills, we can go ahead and we can teach these particular skills in order for them to benefit from this skill of observational learning. Because by engaging in observational learning, we're going to open up this world for them where they can now learn and acquire new skills without having to be directly taught those particular skills. They can learn through maybe watching a video. I learn through watching videos all the time. I learn through hearing about people's stories all the time. So it's very beneficial to be able to learn and acquire new skills without having to experience every single little thing on your own.